hate this game. Same gameplay after hours, it was boring. Bad boss battles, too long, and MJ Wick. What a way to ruin a game. This was obviously funded by BlackRock. Good game, I just have skill issue. We'll get hate for this, but want to voice that this game is not for everyone. The sheer amount of micromanagement you have to do in this game drove me crazy. Companions are all unrealistically horny to the point that it's just annoying. Here's a good example of a dev team focusing too much on what they want to do without a good leadership team in place. Overdeveloped fluff content? Check. Limited level cap? Check. EA Studios is great at this. Worst Spider-Man story I have ever seen. Gameplay is crazy, but everything else is just nope. Boss fights are bad, in-game suits were like a joke, and don't get me started with all the proper. I just couldn't get into it. I fell asleep while playing yesterday and ended up just uninstalling. The story is mediocre and the gameplay is exactly the same as the previous two games. No idea what all the hype is about, but I'm done with it for now. The phrase "everyone is entitled to their own opinion" can go a little far sometimes. Sure, you could say Battle for Bikini Bottom is better to you than Mario Odyssey, but you would be wrong. It's usually that simple, but often I find myself on the other side of the argument a lot. Games people love, I'm not fond of, and people think I'm crazy. We've seen ridiculous Steam reviews, we've seen ridiculous comments from maybe our own friends, or maybe we hold those opinions that we think are correct, but everyone says you're wrong. Why is that? See, I'm a little different. For most people, it would be simple enough to say it's just your preference, but for me, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into it. It turns out there's actually a lot of psychology behind it that could actually solve a lot of problems in the gaming world in terms of discourse and how we talk about games and how we even make games. Quick disclaimer, this video is going to be like the first in a series where it's going to be more podcast style. I'm going to be discussing what I learned this week in game development. So just to reiterate, if you've been living under a rock, the Game Awards happened a few months ago and people have been going nuts over Baldur's Gate 3 taking basically a clean sweep and games like Spider-Man 2 getting no awards. It's interesting because this year kind of exposed a lot of the discourse between what you would call casual gamers and hardcore gamers. And casual gamers represent the Spider-Man 2 side, with Baldur's Gate representing the hardcore side. Honestly, the debate is pretty old and tiring at this point, and it's turned pretty toxic. And the reason why is no one's really trying to think deeply about this topic. Now, I would be considered more of a hardcore gamer, so I don't really think that those terms are correct or accurate, but actually, this is the divide between gamers looking for depth in their games versus gamers looking for width in their games. Baldur's Gate 3 is like a D&D game, and Spider-Man 2 is MCU's darling game come to life. It's basically a superhero character with Call of Duty's budget, and it basically attracts that same audience that you would see going to see the latest Spider-Man film. But it's not deep. The combat in that game is not deep at all. The story is not a deep story at all. Everything is very surface level, but it provides you enough surface level that the experience never gets boring. And Baldur's Gate 3 is not a wide-ranging experience. It's a very deep experience where if there are certain things you like, you can master it, you can learn it very deeply and intricately and explore different things about it. But it does offer a very narrow experience. You can actually take that as face value and say, okay, some people like deep experiences and some people just like surface level experiences. But that's actually kind of disrespectful to the people that prefer Spider-Man. The reason I'm talking about this now, I'm making a 3D platformer game and I've been studying a lot of the games in that genre. And I figured I would take some notes about my experience. So I'm going to try to explain the philosophy behind the different types of games and why that actually matters. There are different kinds of players, we all know that, but when it comes to making games, you need to understand who you're trying to market your game to. I feel like most 3D platformers that are heralded as really good are surface level and wide-ranging experiences. But the ones that I enjoy are usually deeper 3D platformers with more intricate experiences and controls, and not necessarily a ton of variety in what you can and cannot do. And I think the reason why that is for me is because 3D platformers tend to focus on collectibles as the core mechanic of the game, but in reality they don't really matter. The goal is collecting them, kind of like the meme, the real treasure is the journey along the way. That's kind of what these games feel like to me. The journey to get them is the fun part, but actually getting these items and collectibles usually has no bearing on the actual mechanics of the game. Some people actually complain when there's not enough things to collect, and this is what led to my theory about depth versus width, and it allowed me to tie that back into Spider-Man and Baldur's Gate, because that's the exact thesis of what I'm discovering this week. I played a few 3D platformer games this week. A few notable ones would be A Hat in Time, Tinykin, I played Billy Hatcher, and I played Mario Sunshine, of course. And the most notable one would be A Hat in Time. That game is really highly appreciated and really highly acclaimed, and me as a solo developer, I would be extremely happy to have my game be a fraction of as good as that game is. But in reality, I don't really like A Hat in Time. People love this game, and it's over 10 million copies sold on Steam alone, according to Steam Spy or other online sources. It's been seen as a savior for the genre, and honestly, you can feel the passion in the game. The characters have so much personality, the levels have so much flair to them. I can acknowledge that it's a good game, but I can also acknowledge that it wasn't made for me. The challenges were my favorite parts of the entire game. It's not like it wasn't fun, it's just a very empty experience for me. While the actual main storyline is very cookie cutter and kind of paint by numbers. Very simple game. Now you could argue that this game is targeted towards younger audiences, and you'd be correct. Pretty much any 3D platformer that I played feels as if they're targeted for a younger person. So what I learned is it's not just, hey, these games are for people looking for wide experiences. It seems that there's a correlation a lot deeper than just casual versus hardcore, because you can be considered a hardcore gamer for playing Billy Hatcher, right? But that is a very casual style game. So the terms don't really make sense when you really put them under any scrutiny. Deeper, more slower games, more challenge-based games are usually geared towards older people who are looking for more fun in a short amount of time, and they're not necessarily looking for a wide array of things. So you could say, I'm looking for old people games, right? But no, that's not really quite the taste either. Allow me one more example here. I have a friend who plays Star Wars everything. He watches Star Wars everything. He loves Star Wars. He actually has a huge online personality on TikTok and other social media talking about Star Wars. And he's never played Knights of the Old Republic. Now, Knights of the Republic to me is rivaling most of Star Wars anything. I like it more than most of the films. But the thing is, the genre of game and the style of play just doesn't appeal to my friend. Regardless how much he loves Star Wars, it's just not his cup of tea. It wasn't designed for someone like him. And to further that example, he doesn't really like RPGs at all. Any JRPGs or even any kind of Western RPGs that have stories and kind of action combat still doesn't necessarily appeal to him, because he's not really interested in long story type games. The only RPG he's ever played is Undertale, and coincidentally, that's one of the only RPGs that I haven't played or have not been interested in for very long. Now, granted, again, I know I'm in the minority on that. Undertale is a good game. That's another game I can acknowledge is extremely well made. That game is almost telepathic in how it understands its audience, but it also understands that I'm not its audience. Now, not to say it's not a hard game, it's actually extremely hard. It's actually extremely deep in terms of what you can do with the story and how immersed you can get into a game. But immersion is not a driving factor in how I select games. So that's what I mean when I say it's not a game made for me, because I'm not into immersion-based games, the same way I'm not into cozy games. So let me explain a little bit about why this even happens, right? A few years ago, I discovered a company called Quantic Foundry. Hopefully I'm saying that name right. I seen a GDC talk from them, and I also discovered their website, in which they have a player motivations model, a data model. They took thousands of players and gave them a psychological quiz, and that quiz was designed to try and understand more about player behavior. What they learned is players play games for very different reasons. One person might play a social game for competition, while the other person might play it for community and belonging. In-game content for one person might be best as New Game Plus, while the other person might want an additional quest or maybe a new character. The data from Quantic Foundry literally explains why we play what we play. And what I find interesting is I can take that data and kind of extrapolate out into what it is now that we're seeing with Baldur's Gate and Spider-Man, and what I was able to see between me and a hat in time. This is what we're experiencing as gaming culture. More people in today's world are looking for action, excitement, and fantasy-based experiences. We are mostly starved of everything else. There are a ton of different motivations, and it seems we're only catering to a short handful of them. These AAA companies are feeding us spectacle games, narrative-based games several times a year. And it's no surprise that, a few years ago, maybe a decade ago, we got to see Dark Souls and Demon Souls on the rise, which catered heavily to the people looking for challenges and depth in their games. Even now, to this day, people are trying to recreate that formula in their game mechanics, but they continue to miss the point of why those games are successful. The only game that I've seen do that well is Lies of P. Lies of P actually continues the feeling of challenge. It continues the feeling of accomplishment in the game. It gives you the depth of the mechanics with the merging of weapons. It seems to actually understand the philosophy behind the genre. It's weird because back in the day, in the arcade days, for you old folk like me, you would see that challenge was probably the main motivation of games back in the day. It was paired heavily with action. Finishing a game used to be a badge of honor. If you were able to beat a game without losing all of your lives or paying $50 in quarters, you were seen as really intelligent or really talented or really good. And that was part of the motivation to play games. Now, this actually shows the opposite rise is happening now with the rise of cozy games. And they're having a moment right now as well. And I can't wait for one game series to really emerge and really nail cozy games, the game that really gets it and kind of stamps it as a genre to stay in the industry. They've really found a way to gamify nostalgia and kind of all the psychological tricks that we learn in the industry. This also explains further the rise of social deduction games like Among Us or Lethal Company, which are games that focus on competition, that focus on community, that focus on the social aspect, but remove the core of action, which it's usually been based around. Back in my era, we play social games and we put a headset on and we curse each other out and play Call of Duty and Halo. Now, these kids are getting together and having fun playing these games that don't have combat or action necessarily as the driving factor of the game. We're seeing different motivations go viral in the gaming industry, because people are not necessarily looking for a casual or hardcore experience. They're looking for a cozy experience. They're looking for a challenging experience. They're looking for a social experience. They're looking for different types of motivations in their games. And that is why we're seeing such a huge disconnect between Spider-Man and Baldur's Gate, because they speak to two totally different motivations of why people play games, and they're both the pinnacle of that motivation. If you love action games, if you love story games, if you love spectacle games, Spider-Man 2 is almost as good as it's ever going to get. And if you love deep games, if you love depth in your games, Baldur's Gate is about as good as it's going to get. And you have people looking at the other game like, I don't understand how this is even good. And I think that's interesting. I wish we lived in a world where people can understand a little bit more about what their motivations are for playing games and how that lines up with the game itself. Because as I discovered this week, certain genres lean towards certain motivations. Strategy games obviously lean towards depth, while 3D platformer games may lead more towards excitement. And I think we naturally kind of segment ourselves into certain genres because we're aware of this. But when it comes to Game of the Year, I think we kind of tend to forget that we all have a preference and it's based on psychology. Quantic actually put out their GDC talk and they talk a lot about this. I would recommend anybody to watch it that's slightly interested in this topic. They even mention how the data of what category or what motivation people like playing games has a lot to do with other factors that I mentioned, like age, or even if you're an introvert or you're an extrovert. It even taps in deeply enough to the Myers-Briggs, and whether you are, or whether you do Enneagrams, or you're an 8 or you're a 9 or whatever, all of those things actually play a role in what types of games you gravitate towards, and it ties heavily into what type of person you are as well. See, when I listen to game reviewers or when I read a game review, a big part of it for me is, who is this person that is reviewing this game? It's almost more important than the actual review. Is this a nerd that's going to care about the lore, and if the story makes perfect sense, or is this a bro that's only gonna care if it's blood everywhere and explosions? Like, who am I listening to? A few of my favorite reviewers ever that I've listened to, the late Total Biscuit, he was amazing because he made it very clear these are the types of games I like, and this is my reaction to this. In certain areas, you're more willing to accept things than others based on your predispositions about the games that you like. Another viewer similar to this is Video Game Donkey. He does a great job of making it clear I don't like RPGs. So if he plays an RPG and you gave it a try and maybe you like this mechanic or you don't like that mechanic, it's helpful. But if I just listen to it as if, every game is the same, I would go into it with the wrong understanding. This is how you get terrible reviews from places like GameSpot or IGN, because we don't know who it is reviewing this actual game. So to tie it all up into a bow, me playing A Hat in Time and Tinykin, I realized that these games are really good in this genre, and they kind of cater to what the audience is actually looking for. They're looking for a wide variety of mechanics, high fidelity games with fluid movement and a ton of charm. They're not necessarily looking for anything deep. 3D platformers are basically a step away from cozy games to a lot of people. And it's not that this is a revelation for me, it just made me more clearly understand why it is that I don't like majority of 3D platformers. And in the future, when I go plan any sort of game at all, I'm definitely going to think, what is it that this audience for this game is looking for? As a Metroidvania fan, I'm looking for depth in my games. I want really interesting mechanics. I want a beautiful world. I want there to be, maybe a little backdrop of a great theme, and I'm good. I think it's really important that we're able to appreciate games for how they're supposed to be made, right? Who they're supposed to be made for. So yeah, that's my rant. Like I said, this series going forward will be what I learned this week in game development. It will be, kind of a more relaxed style, more podcast style. And I will continue with devlogs at least once a month in my devlogs, so you guys can get an understanding of what it is I'm making. But yeah, I just wanted to kick it with you guys and explain a little bit about what I've been doing. Tinykin is really cool. A Hat in Time, I really enjoy playing that game, and I just hope I can make something cool. So yeah, I've been GC Rex. This is the Game Courier channel, and appreciate you guys for taking your time listening. Peace.